Here's a scene worth sitting with. Someone opens their banking app on an ordinary Thursday evening, nothing special about the day. They're not checking it for any particular reason, just a habit. Nothing about the moment looks significant. No confetti, no big reveal. Just a screen, a number, and someone glancing at it the way you'd glance at the weather. And yet, somewhere around this exact number, something in how they make decisions has already started to shift, quietly enough that most people never notice it happening in real time. Here's a question worth sitting with before we go further. Why does $15,000, not $100,000, not $1 million, just $15,000, change how a person's brain actually processes a financial decision? Because something has changed here. Not dramatic. Nobody quits their job at $15,000. Nobody buys a boat. But there's a specific, well-documented shift that happens right around this number, and almost nobody names it directly. There's a term for exactly what changes. We'll get to it in a few minutes, and once you understand it, you'll probably recognize it in your own life, whether you're above this number or still climbing toward it. My name is Nick, and I spend a probably unhealthy amount of time thinking about money. Most of what gets discussed in personal finance jumps straight to the big numbers: $1 million, early retirement, generational wealth, and I understand why. Those numbers are exciting. But I think skipping past the smaller thresholds misses something important, because the psychological shifts that happen early are in some ways more foundational than anything that happens later. It's a little like only ever talking about a building's rooftop view and never mentioning the foundation that makes standing up there possible in the first place. The foundation isn't as exciting to talk about. It's also the part that determines whether everything built on top of it actually holds. Today I want to talk about $15,000 specifically, not because it's a magic number, but because it sits at a very particular, well-understood point in how people relate to risk, decisions, and their own sense of financial control. Here's the assumption most people carry about small savings milestones: that they don't really matter, that $15,000 is just a smaller, less interesting version of $100,000, and nothing meaningfully changes until the number gets a lot bigger. It's an understandable assumption. $15,000 doesn't buy a house. It doesn't replace income. Next to the milestones this channel usually talks about, $650,000, $1 million, the numbers that fund entire retirements, it looks almost small enough to skip past entirely. That assumption is backwards. The biggest psychological shift in this entire process doesn't happen at $500,000. It happens much earlier, at the point where someone stops making dozens of small, anxious financial calculations every single day, simply because they no longer have to. Here's what actually happens somewhere around $15,000, and it isn't about what the money can buy. Below this point, almost every financial decision gets run through a survival filter. Can I afford this? What happens if something goes wrong this month? The brain treats each choice as a small risk against a thin margin. Above this point, roughly the range that covers 3 to 6 months of typical living expenses for many people, something changes. Decisions stop being about survival and start being about preference. Does that distinction sound small to you? It shouldn't. The difference between "can I afford this" and "do I actually want this" is one of the more significant shifts in how a person experiences money day to day, and it happens at a number of most financial content skips right past on the way to bigger targets. Here's a concrete way to see it. A car repair, a dental bill, a month without a paycheck between jobs. Most single financial shocks that derail people fall somewhere between a few hundred and a few $1,000s. At $15,000, the vast majority of those shocks stop being emergencies. They become inconveniences. Annoying, yes. Threatening, no. Think about what that actually removes from someone's week. The transmission that needs replacing doesn't trigger 3 sleepless nights and a scramble across 4 credit cards. It triggers an appointment, a bill, and a Tuesday that's slightly more annoying than the Monday before it. The dentist visit that used to mean postponing it for months, hoping the pain would just go away on its own, becomes a scheduled appointment like any other. None of this feels dramatic from the outside, but each one of these small reclassifications, from threat to inconvenience, removes a specific kind of background tension that most people carry without ever naming it. And that reclassification, from threat to inconvenience, is the actual milestone, not the number on the screen. What the number quietly does to the decision underneath it. This is also why 2 people with the exact same $15,000 balance can experience it completely differently. Someone who reached it through years of careful, deliberate saving tends to notice the shift almost immediately. They've been tracking the margin closely enough to feel it widen. Someone who arrived at the same number more passively sometimes doesn't notice for months, simply because they weren't measuring their decisions against the threshold in the first place. The number does the same quiet work either way. Noticing it just makes the shift easier to actually use, deliberately, instead of drifting through it unaware. Now I want to pause here, because there's an objection forming. Okay, Nick, that sounds nice, but is there actually a mechanism behind it, or is this just a feel-good story about a round number? Fair question. And there is an actual, well-documented mechanism behind it, not a vague feeling, something psychologists have studied directly. Here's the mechanism, and it has a name: decision fatigue, the well-documented pattern where every choice you make in a day draws from the same limited pool of mental energy, and that pool runs thinner as the day goes on. Below $15,000, money touches an enormous number of small daily decisions: the coffee, the lunch, the slightly cheaper gas station 3 minutes away. Each one is tiny, but each one costs a small amount of the same mental energy you need for everything else that day: your work, your relationships, your actual important decisions. Psychologists who study this describe it less like running out of willpower and more like a muscle that tires with repeated use across a day. It's why the 15th small decision of an afternoon so often feels harder than the first, not because the decision itself is more complicated, but because there's simply less left in the tank to make it with. Money, when the margin is thin, quietly injects itself into an enormous number of these small decisions. Every purchase becomes a tiny negotiation for yourself. Have you ever noticed you make worse decisions late in the day, after a long stretch of smaller ones? That's not a coincidence. That's the same limited resource, spent. Once someone crosses roughly $15,000, a huge number of those small financial calculations simply stop happening. Not because the person suddenly has unlimited money. They don't. Because the margin is finally wide enough that most small purchases no longer require a calculation at all. That mental energy doesn't disappear. It gets spent somewhere else, on work, on relationships, on the decisions that actually move the bigger number forward. There's a reason this particular shift tends to go unnoticed even by the person experiencing it. Nobody sits down and consciously totals up how many fewer calculations they made this week compared to last year. The change shows up sideways, in slightly less irritability by Thursday, with a little more patience left over for a difficult conversation, in falling asleep a bit faster than the version of themselves who used to lie there running numbers. None of it gets attributed to the $15,000, but most of it traces back to exactly that number. So, what does someone actually do differently once they understand this, rather than just feeling it happens by accident? The most useful thing is simply naming the shift honestly, instead of mistaking it for something bigger than it is. $15,000 doesn't make anyone wealthy. It doesn't replace income. What it does is remove a specific category of daily friction, the smallest, most repetitive financial decisions, and that removal is worth recognizing, deliberately, instead of taking for granted. There's a real risk on the other side of this milestone too, worth naming honestly. Some people cross this exact number and mistake the relief for abundance, easing contributions, upgrading a few too many things at once, treating the margin as a reward rather than a foundation still being built. The shift in daily decision-making is real. The number itself is still small enough that it needs to keep growing, not get spent down in celebration of having arrived somewhere. Using the rule of 72, dividing 72 by an assumed average annual return to roughly estimate doubling time, at a typical long-run average of around 7%, an amount like this roughly doubles in about 10 years left untouched, before any further contributions are even added. That's not the exciting part of this milestone. The exciting part already happened, quietly, in how the daily decisions changed. It's worth being honest about the timeline here too. For someone contributing a modest, steady amount each month, reaching this point from zero typically takes somewhere in the range of a few years, not a single dramatic season, but not an impossibly distant horizon either. The exact number moves depending on the contribution and the market along the way. What stays consistent is the shape of the shift once someone arrives, regardless of exactly how long the road there took. Remember the limited pool of mental energy from a few minutes ago, the one that decision to fatigue quietly drains, one small choice at a time. Here's the part worth building on purpose, instead of just letting happen by accident. That freed up mental energy is, in its own way, as valuable as the $15,000 itself. And just like the money, it can be spent carelessly or invested deliberately. Someone who notices the shift can actually redirect that energy toward the decisions that move the bigger number forward. Negotiating a raise instead of dreading the conversation, researching a better account instead of leaving money idle, noticing a wasteful subscription instead of letting it renew unexamined for another year. The practical version of all this is almost disappointingly simply. Keep the automation exactly as it was before this milestone. Let the number keep growing toward the next one. And notice, deliberately, the specific decisions that used to require a calculation and no longer do. Not to celebrate them loudly, just to recognize that the plan is doing exactly what it was supposed to do, quietly, in the background, long before the bigger numbers arrive. This is the same principle behind everything this channel has said about automation from the very beginning, just showing up in a slightly different form. The system doesn't need a person's full attention or daily willpower to keep working. It needs to be left alone, consistently, while the freed-up attention goes somewhere more useful than a 4-3 calculation of whether today's coffee is worth it. So, back to that Thursday evening, the banking app, the number that doesn't look dramatic on a screen but quietly changes something underneath it. This is exactly the stretch Mira moved through a few years into her own machine, long before the bigger milestones this channel has talked about. Nobody names this one, because it doesn't look impressive from the outside, but it's often the first moment the daily fog actually lifts. She didn't feel wealthy that Thursday. She didn't feel like anything had changed in any way she could point to a graph. But the coffee didn't require calculations anymore. The car noise she'd been ignoring for 2 weeks finally got booked in for a look, instead of postponed out of quiet dread. Small things. The kind of small things that don't show up in a screenshot of an account balance but add up to a noticeably quieter week. She didn't tell anyone about it. There was nothing dramatic enough to tell. But the notebook on her desk, if you looked closely that month, had one new line under the others. Not a big proclamation, just a small, private observation. The fog is lifting, one decision at a time. Here's what I want you to take from this. The biggest shift in how money feels day to day doesn't happen at the finish line. It happens quietly, early, the first time a small emergency stops being a threat and starts being an inconvenience. Nothing dramatic changed on the screen tonight, but something changed in the decision underneath it, and that's the part actually worth noticing. So, I want to ask you something. Have you noticed this shift yourself, the point where small financial decisions stopped costing you mental energy every day? Drop it in the comments, and the number if you're comfortable sharing it. I'm genuinely curious about where this lands for most people. And if this helped, subscribe, because next time we jump forward again to the milestone this channel has called the hardest climb, the specific point where the effort finally starts to feel like it's paying off in a way you can actually see. I'll see you there.